Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the sandals of an ordinary Roman citizen living through one of history's most dramatic collapses. You wake up in 476 AD to the sound of empty grain carts rattling over cobblestones, their wooden wheels echoing hollowly through streets that once bustled with abundance. The morning air carries the acrid smell of smoke from distant fires, and you can hear the desperate voices of your neighbours already gathering at the distribution centres, hoping against hope that today there might be bread. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why the mightiest empire in human history could simply disappear. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to share where and when you started watching, or perhaps tell me what drew you to tonight's journey through Rome's final chapter. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You pull your threadbare cloak tighter against the morning chill, and step into streets that feel increasingly foreign in your own city. The marble facades still gleam in the early sunlight, but behind those impressive walls, you know the reality is far different. Your stomach gnaws at you. It's been gnawing for months now, as you join the growing crowd shuffling toward the bread distribution point near the old theatre of Marcellus. The line stretches farther than it did yesterday, and you recognise faces that once belonged to merchants, minor officials, even a few patricians who've fallen on hard times. Everyone looks a little thinner, a little more desperate than they did last week. The woman ahead of you clutches a ceramic pot that she hopes to trade for grain. Actual Roman coins have become increasingly worthless, and even the grain distributors now prefer bartered goods. You remember when your father told stories of the great grain fleets from Egypt, how massive ships would dock at Portus loaded with enough wheat to feed the city for months. Those ships stopped coming regularly years ago, and now the granaries that once bulged with surplus stand mostly empty. The few remaining supplies come from whatever local farmers can spare, and that's precious little with Germanic tribes raiding the countryside. As you shuffle forward in line, you overhear fragments of conversation that paint a picture of a city slowly starving. Someone mentions that the Bakers' Guild is mixing sawdust with what little flour remains. Another voice whispers about families in the Subura district boiling leather scraps to make soup. These aren't rumours anymore, they're survival strategies. The distribution official, a harried-looking man with ink-stained fingers, finally reaches your spot in line. He's one of the few remaining civil servants still trying to maintain order in a system that's crumbling around him. When you present your token, a small bronze piece that proves your right to the grain dole, he shakes his head apologetically. Today's shipment was smaller than expected, and you're just a few people too late. You're not surprised. Really, this has happened 3 times in the past 2 weeks. What surprises you is that you're not angry anymore, just tired. The fury that burned in your chest months ago when this crisis first began has faded to a dull acceptance. This is simply what life in Rome has become. Walking home empty-handed, you pass the fountain where you used to meet friends for morning gossip. The marble nymphs still pour water from their urns, but the flow has slowed to a trickle. Even the aqueducts, those marvels of Roman engineering that have supplied the city for centuries, are showing signs of neglect. Repairs that once would have been completed within days now go unaddressed for months. You pause at a bakery that's been in the same family for 4 generations. The wooden shutters are closed, and a small sign written in shaky Latin explains that they'll reopen when supplies permit. The baker's children used to play in the street out front, but you haven't seen them in weeks. Historians still argue whether the population decline in late imperial Rome was primarily due to plague, famine, or mass migration. But standing here on this empty street, the cause matters less than the effect. Your own apartment building, a modest insula near the Campus Martius, shows the same signs of decline. The ground floor shops that once sold imported silks and spices now stand vacant. Their owners either fled to the countryside or reduced to selling whatever scraps they can find. The building's superintendent, who used to take pride in keeping the common areas clean, now spends his days searching for firewood and edible plants. As you climb the narrow stairs to your third-floor room, you can hear Mrs. Claudia on the second floor teaching her grandchildren to count in Gothic. It's a practical decision, more practical than teaching them advanced Latin rhetoric. Anyway, the Gothic federates who've been settled in Roman territories for decades are increasingly the ones with steady work and reliable income. Your small room contains the basics: a bed, a table, a few cooking vessels, and a trunk containing what remains of your family's possessions. On the wall hangs a small bronze medallion bearing the image of Emperor Romulus Augustulus, though everyone knows the real power lies with Odoacer, the Germanic king who conquered Italy. The irony isn't lost on you that the last Western Roman emperor shares a name with the legendary founder of Rome. Looking out your window toward the Palatine Hill, you can see the imperial palaces still gleaming in the distance. But they feel as remote as the moon. The connection between ordinary citizens and imperial power, already tenuous, has essentially dissolved. You're not exactly sure when you stopped thinking of yourself as living in the Roman Empire and started simply thinking of yourself as trying to survive in a dangerous world. The afternoon brings no relief from the morning's disappointments. You spend time mending a tunic that's been patched so many times it resembles a patchwork quilt more than clothing. Your neighbours gather in the courtyard below, sharing information about which parts of the city are safe to visit and which should be avoided. The urban prefect's guards still patrol some areas, but their numbers have dwindled, and their authority is increasingly questioned. Evening falls early, and with it comes the familiar sounds of a city learning to live with less. Fewer oil lamps flicker in windows. Fewer voices echo through the streets. The great city that once boasted over 1 million inhabitants feels almost empty, though you know thousands of people still call it home. As you settle into sleep, your last conscious thought is wondering whether tomorrow's bread line might move a little faster. You're awakened before dawn by unfamiliar voices speaking in guttural Germanic tones just outside your building. Peering through your small window, you see a family of Goths setting up what appears to be a permanent camp in the abandoned shop below the baker's place. The father, a tall man with intricate braided hair and well-maintained weapons, directs his wife and children as they unload a cart filled with their possessions. What strikes you most isn't their foreignness, it's how organised and purposeful they seem compared to the Romans you've been seeing lately. The Gothic family moves with the confidence of people who know exactly what they're doing. The woman begins immediately sweeping out the shop space while her husband examines the building's structure with the eye of someone planning to stay. Their children, rather than running wild as you might expect from barbarians, help methodically sort through bundles of tools, household goods, and what appears to be seed for planting. These aren't raiders or refugees, they're settlers. By the time you've dressed and made your way downstairs, the Gothic father is already in conversation with your building's superintendent. What surprises you is that they're speaking in perfectly serviceable Latin, though heavily accented. The Goth is explaining that he served in the Roman army for 12 years under various Germanic commanders and received this shop space as part of his settlement grant. He has official papers, signed by Odoacer's administration, giving him legal right to establish his family here. Your superintendent, a man who's lived in this neighbourhood his entire life, nods wearily and welcomes the newcomers. There's no anger in his voice, just resignation. At least someone's moving in instead of moving out. He mutters to you later. It's true, over the past year, you've watched Roman families abandon their homes and businesses, usually heading toward relatives in the countryside or seeking opportunities in the Eastern Empire. The Gothic children fascinate you despite yourself. The oldest, a boy perhaps 12 years old, speaks 3 languages fluently, his native Gothic, Latin, and what sounds like Frankish. When you pause to listen, you realise he's translating for his younger sister, explaining Roman customs and city living. These children are growing up trilingual in a way that would have been remarkable for patrician Romans just a generation ago. Throughout the morning, more Germanic families arrive in your district. Some are Goths, others appear to be Vandals or Suebi based on their distinctive clothing and weapons. What they all share is a sense of legitimate belonging that many Romans seem to have lost. They're not squatters or invaders in the traditional sense. They carry settlement documents. They respect property boundaries. And they're clearly planning to contribute to the community rather than simply exploit it. The irony becomes apparent when you visit the forum later that day. Roman citizens cluster in small groups, complaining about the barbarian invasion and lamenting the loss of traditional Roman values. Meanwhile, the Germanic settlers are the ones actually maintaining their properties, learning Latin and adapting to urban life. Historians still argue whether the transformation of the Western Empire was primarily conquest or evolution, but from your street-level perspective, it looks more like replacement than destruction. Your new Gothic neighbour introduces himself as Athanaric, a name that sounds simultaneously foreign and oddly familiar. He explains that his grandfather fought against Rome. His father fought for Rome, and he served Rome until Rome essentially ceased to exist as a functioning entity. Now he serves Odoacer, but he seems to view this as a natural progression rather than a betrayal. Rome is an idea. He tells you in his careful Latin, ideas change hands. The practical implications of these new neighbours become clear throughout the week. While Roman shops remain shuttered due to supply problems, Athanaric's family immediately begins trading with other Germanic settlers who've established themselves throughout the city. They have access to goods and resources that traditional Roman merchants can no longer obtain. Their network extends beyond the city walls to farming communities and trading posts that Roman authorities no longer effectively control. You find yourself in the peculiar position of needing to ask barbarians for help obtaining basic necessities. Athanaric's wife, whose Latin is limited but whose gesture vocabulary is extensive, offers to trade some grain for help teaching her children to read Roman-style accounting records. It's a fair exchange, but it represents a fundamental shift in how your neighbourhood operates. The children adapt fastest to these changes. Roman and Germanic kids begin playing together in the streets, creating hybrid games that combine Roman ball sports with Germanic wrestling traditions. Their parents watch nervously at first, but practical concerns soon override cultural prejudices. When food is scarce and security uncertain, having friendly neighbours matters more than having purely Roman neighbours. The linguistic changes happen gradually but inexorably. Latin remains the official language of commerce and administration, but Gothic and Frankish phrases creep into everyday conversation. You find yourself learning Germanic words for concepts that don't translate well into Latin, particularly words related to community cooperation and shared responsibility. The Romans had legal concepts with these ideas, but the Germanic peoples seem to have more practical approaches. Religious differences prove less problematic than you expected. Many of the Germanic settlers are Arian Christians, which Roman Catholic authorities view as heretical. But on a neighbourhood level, the distinctions matter little. Everyone prays to Christ. Everyone observes similar moral codes, and everyone faces the same daily challenges of finding food and maintaining safety. Theological debates seem like luxuries compared to practical survival. What disturbs you most isn't the presence of Germanic families, it's the absence of Roman authority. No officials come to register the new residents, no tax collectors appear to assess their properties. No military recruiters arrive to conscript their young men. The administrative apparatus that once managed every aspect of urban life has simply evaporated. Your new neighbours fill a vacuum rather than displace an existing system. By month's end, your street looks and sounds different but functions better than it has in years. The Germanic settlers have repaired communal wells, organised neighbourhood watch groups, and established reliable trade connections with rural suppliers. They've brought skills that complement urban Roman capabilities: metalworking, animal husbandry, and practical engineering. The combination creates a more resilient community than either group could maintain alone. Late one evening, as you lie in bed listening to Athanaric's family sharing stories in their musical Germanic tongue, you realise that you're witnessing something historians will puzzle over for centuries. This isn't the violent collapse of civilization. It's civilization adapting, evolving, and finding new forms. The Rome you knew is disappearing, but something new and potentially viable is taking its place. One neighbourhood at a time. You clutch a handful of silver denarii in your palm as you approach Marcus the oil merchant's stall. The same stall where your family has purchased lamp oil for 3 generations. The coins feel substantial and reassuring. Genuine Roman silver bearing the profiles of emperors stretching back decades. But when you extend your hand to complete what should be a routine transaction, Marcus shakes his head with the expression that's become all too familiar throughout the city. "I'm sorry, friend," he says, "not meeting your eyes directly. Silver's not worth what it used to be. Too much of it floating around, and half of it's been clipped or debased. I need something I can actually use." He gestures toward a collection of goods behind his counter: ceramic pots, iron tools, bolts of rough cloth, even some exotic amber beads that clearly didn't originate in Roman territories. The economic reality hits you like a physical blow. These coins, minted in official imperial workshops and bearing the sacred images of Roman authority, have become essentially worthless in practical commerce. You've heard rumours about this happening, but experiencing it firsthand feels like watching the foundation of civilization crumble in real time. Roman currency once held value from Britain to Mesopotamia, but now a local oil merchant won't accept it for basic necessities. Marcus explains the situation with the weary patience of someone who's had this conversation dozens of times. The new Germanic administration keeps minting coins, but they're using less silver and more base metals. Meanwhile, everyone's hoarding the old silver ones, thinking they'll be worth more later. The result is that nobody trusts any coins anymore, Roman, Gothic, or otherwise. Barter's more reliable. You dig through your belongings at home, searching for items that might interest Marcus. A bronze mirror that belonged to your grandmother, some wool fabric you'd been saving for winter clothing, a collection of writing styluses that seem absurdly obsolete now that literacy rates are plummeting. These become your new currency. The mirror trades for a week's worth of oil, a transaction that would have cost you a single coin just 2 years ago. The shift away from monetary exchange affects every aspect of daily life in ways both subtle and profound. Without standardized currency, every transaction requires negotiation. The baker might accept grain in exchange for bread, but only if it's good grain, and only if he currently needs grain rather than firewood or cloth or metalwork. Simple purchases that once took moments now consume entire afternoons of bargaining and evaluation. You discover that different neighbourhoods have developed their own informal exchange systems. Near the docks, where Germanic traders arrive regularly, Baltic amber and furs hold premium value. In the artisan quarters, worked metal objects command respect. Around the remaining government buildings, anything that demonstrates literacy, scrolls, writing materials, even well-crafted Latin inscriptions, can be traded for substantial goods. The transformation forces you to develop skills you never needed as a Roman citizen. You learn to assess the quality of cloth by touch, to estimate the purity of metals by weight and colour, to judge the freshness of food products by subtle signs your ancestors might have known, but your generation had forgotten. Roman civilization had specialised to the point where citizens could live entire lives without understanding basic crafts, but that luxury has evaporated along with reliable currency. Athanaric, your Gothic neighbour, proves surprisingly helpful in navigating this new economy. Germanic peoples, he explains, have maintained barter traditions alongside their adoption of Roman coinage, so the transition feels less jarring to them. He teaches you that a good iron knife is worth approximately 15 pounds of grain, that amber beads from the Baltic coast trade at premium rates due to their rarity and beauty, and that well-tanned leather commands higher value than silver jewellery. The psychological impact of worthless coins extends beyond mere inconvenience. Roman identity was deeply connected to Roman institutions, and currency represented one of the most visible symbols of imperial power and unity. When shopkeepers reject Roman money, they're implicitly rejecting Roman authority. Each refused transaction feels like a small act of rebellion against an empire that can no longer protect or provide for its citizens. You witness fascinating adaptations to the currency crisis throughout the city. Some merchants develop elaborate credit systems based on personal relationships and reputation rather than monetary deposits. Others create private currencies, tokens or tallies that represent goods stored in specific warehouses or workshops. A few entrepreneurial Romans begin specializing in evaluation services, charging small fees to assess the trade value of various goods. The administrative implications prove even more challenging than commercial ones. Roman government had always depended on taxation collected in standardized currency, but what happens when that currency becomes worthless? Odoacer's administration attempts to collect taxes in goods rather than coins, but evaluating and storing thousands of different products creates logistical nightmares that Roman bureaucracy was never designed to handle. Historians still argue whether the collapse of Roman currency was a cause or effect of imperial decline, but from your daily experience, it feels like both simultaneously. The worthless coins in your palm represent not just economic failure, but the breakdown of trust between government and citizens. When people stop believing in a society's money, they've essentially stopped believing in that society's future. Your evening meal consists of bread purchased with ceramic bowls, oil obtained through grandmother's mirror, and wine acquired by teaching a Germanic merchant's son to write Latin letters. It's adequate nutrition, but the complexity of obtaining it exhausts you more than physical labour ever did. You fall asleep wondering how long a civilization can function when every simple transaction requires negotiations that would have challenged medieval diplomats. The strangest realization comes weeks later when you find yourself preferring barter to the old coin system. Direct exchange feels more honest somehow. You trade genuine value for genuine value without the abstract intermediary of currency that might prove worthless tomorrow. Perhaps the barbarians understood something about economics that sophisticated Romans had forgotten in their pursuit of financial complexity. As you drift towards sleep, the rejected coins on your table catch moonlight streaming through the window, looking beautiful and utterly useless in the pale light. You decide to take the long route to the market today, wandering through the Forum Romanum where your grandfather once told you he witnessed senators debating the fate of distant provinces. The marble steps leading to the Curia Julia still gleam white in the morning sun, but as you climb them, your footsteps echo in a space that feels cavernously empty. Inside the great hall where Rome's most powerful men once gathered to shape the destiny of the known world, you find only pigeons nesting in the ornate cornices and a few elderly beggars seeking shelter from the wind. The silence strikes you most profoundly. This building was designed to contain the voices of 300 senators engaged in passionate debate about taxation, military campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations. The acoustic properties that once carried oratory to every corner of the chamber now amplify only the soft cooing of birds and the occasional shuffle of feet as homeless citizens seek temporary refuge among the abandoned marble benches. One of the beggars, a man whose expensive but tattered toga suggests fallen patrician status, recognizes your curiosity and approaches with the eager desperation of someone starved for intellectual conversation. He introduces himself as Gaius Flavius Maximus, claiming descent from a consul of the previous century. Though such claims have become common among Rome's growing population of educated destitutes, I attended the last real session, he tells you, gesturing toward the raised platform where consuls once presided. 3 senators showed up. 3! And they spent most of their time arguing about who had authority to call the meeting to order. His laugh carries bitter undertones. The great Roman Senate, reduced to a committee that couldn't organize its own dissolution. Gaius explains that the Senate's decline didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual bleeding away of relevance and authority that accelerated dramatically in recent years. First, real power shifted to military commanders who controlled actual armies. Then, the emperors moved their courts away from Rome entirely, governing from Ravenna or Milan where they felt safer from political intrigue and barbarian raids. The administrative records scattered throughout the building tell a story of institutional collapse through mundane details. Attendance rolls show increasingly sparse participation in senatorial sessions. Budget documents reveal that the state could no longer afford basic maintenance for government buildings, let alone fund the elaborate public works projects that had once demonstrated Roman power and prosperity to the world. You pick up a wax tablet that still bears traces of someone's attempt to record legislative proceedings, but the handwriting is barely literate, and the Latin grammar would make Cicero weep. The quality of public servants has clearly deteriorated along with everything else. Competent administrators can find better opportunities elsewhere, leaving government positions to whoever remains desperate enough to accept payment in nearly worthless currency. The Forum's other buildings reflect similar abandonment, the Basilica Julia, where commercial disputes were once adjudicated by learned jurists, now hosts a few Germanic merchants conducting business according to their own traditional legal codes. They eye you warily as you pass, not with hostility, but with the caution of people who understand they're operating in a legal vacuum where Roman law no longer provides reliable protection. Historians still argue whether the Senate's decline was primarily due to emperors consolidating power or external pressures from barbarian kingdoms. But standing here among the empty marble benches, the distinction seems academic. Power flows toward whoever can actually exercise it effectively, and Rome's traditional institutions have demonstrated their inability to address contemporary challenges. The Temple of Vesta nearby still maintains its sacred fire, though the Vestal Virgins now number only 2 elderly women who seem to be going through the emotions more from habit than religious conviction. They acknowledge your respectful nod, but appear isolated from the broader community in a way that would have been unthinkable during the Republic or early Empire. You encounter Marcus Aurelius Corvus, one of the few remaining senators who still bothers to visit the city regularly. He's a practical man in his 60s who inherited his position and treats it more like an honorary title than an active political role. We meet occasionally, he tells you over wine in a nearby tavern, usually to ratify decisions that Odoacer's administration has already made and implemented. It maintains the fiction of Roman continuity, which has diplomatic value with the Eastern Empire. Corvus's pragmatic acceptance represents how many traditional Romans have adapted to their changed circumstances. Rather than raging against the dissolution of ancient institutions, they've learned to find dignity and purpose within new realities. He spends most of his time managing his family's remaining agricultural properties outside the city, leaving politics to people who actually command armies and control resources. The abandoned government buildings serve as powerful symbols for the broader population, Children play gladiator games in the empty chambers where senators once debated the fate of nations. Women gather there to gossip and mend clothing, treating the marble halls like any other public space. The buildings retain their physical grandeur, but their political significance has evaporated like morning mist. Walking home through streets where Germanic federates now patrol instead of Roman urban cohorts, you reflect on how institutions that seem permanent and inevitable can simply cease to function. The Senate wasn't destroyed by violence or formal abolition. It became irrelevant because it could no longer address the challenges that citizens actually faced. When people need food, security, and basic administration, empty ceremonial debates about constitutional precedents offer little practical value. Your evening meal, acquired through the complex barter negotiations that have replaced monetary commerce, tastes the same whether or not the Roman Senate technically still exists. The Germanic families in your neighbourhood resolve disputes through informal mediation rather than formal legal proceedings, and their system seems to work as well as the old Roman courts ever did. Perhaps better, since everyone involved has genuine stakes in maintaining community harmony. As darkness falls and you settle into sleep, you can hear the sound of wind whistling through the abandoned government buildings. It's a lonely sound, like the ghost of Roman authority mourning its own passing. But tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities that require practical solutions, rather than institutional nostalgia. The marble halls will endure long after the political systems they housed have been forgotten, serving as monuments to the impermanence of even the mightiest human achievements. You first notice something's wrong with the water when you visit the neighbourhood fountain that has reliably served your district for over 2 centuries. The bronze dolphins that normally spout steady streams into the marble basin are producing only intermittent dribbles, and the water that does emerge carries a brownish tint that makes you hesitate before filling your ceramic jug. The fountain's carved inscription still proudly declares it a gift from Emperor Trajan to the people of Rome. But Trajan's generosity seems increasingly theoretical when you're staring at empty pipes. The fountain keeper, an elderly man named Lucius, whose father and grandfather held the same position, shakes his head with the frustrated resignation of someone watching a lifetime's work crumble. It's the aqueduct, he explains, pointing toward the distant hills where the Aqua Claudia begins its 40-mile journey to the city. Nobody's maintaining the channels anymore. Debris builds up, sections collapse, and the water finds other places to go. This particular fountain once received water from 3 separate aqueducts, a redundancy that Roman engineers built into the system to ensure consistent supply even during maintenance or emergencies. But redundancy only works when someone maintains all the backup systems, and the skeleton crews currently responsible for Rome's water infrastructure lack both the manpower and resources to keep multiple aqueducts functioning properly. You join a growing crowd of neighbours investigating the water shortage, and the conversation reveals how widespread the problem has become. The fountain near the old gladiator school stopped flowing entirely last week. The public baths in the next district have reduced their hours and raised their prices because they can only fill the pools halfway. Even the wealthy villa owners on the Palatine Hill are experiencing reduced water pressure, which somehow makes the crisis feel more democratically distributed. Gaius, your neighbour who works as a maintenance supervisor for what remains of the city's public works department, provides technical insights that make the situation sound even worse than it appears. The aqueducts aren't just pipes, he explains with the patient tone of an expert addressing laypeople. They're incredibly sophisticated engineering systems with precise gradients, settling tanks, distribution chambers, and pressure regulation points. When you stop maintaining any part of the system, the whole thing starts failing in cascade effects. The 11 aqueducts that once supplied Rome with an estimated 50 gallons of water per person per day, more than most modern cities provide, represented one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. But engineering marvels require constant attention from skilled technicians, and skilled technicians require steady payment, reliable supply chains for materials, and administrative support for their work. None of these elements remain consistently available in contemporary Rome. You decide to walk part of the Aqua Virgo's route to see the deterioration firsthand. And what you discover both amazes and depresses you. The Roman engineers who built these systems created structures that were meant to last millennia, and in many places they're still functioning despite years of neglect. Massive stone arches stride across valleys with mathematical precision, their foundations so solid that complete collapse seems impossible, even without maintenance. But engineering perfection can't overcome systematic abandonment. At several points along the aqueduct, you find breaks where winter ice has cracked the waterproof cement lining, and nobody has returned to make repairs. Vegetation grows through gaps in the stonework, gradually widening the cracks through root pressure. Most troubling, you discover places where local inhabitants have deliberately diverted water for their own use, creating unauthorized branches that reduce flow to the city. The social implications of water shortage extend far beyond simple inconvenience. Roman urban life had evolved around abundant water supply. Public baths served as social centres. Fountains provided gathering places for neighbourhood communities. And private homes featured elaborate plumbing systems that required consistent pressure to function. As water becomes unreliable, these social institutions begin breaking down along with the infrastructure that supported them. The public baths present a particularly poignant example of institutional decay. You visit the baths of Caracalla, where your grandfather once spent leisurely afternoons discussing philosophy with friends in heated pools surrounded by magnificent marble statuary. The building remains architecturally stunning, but the reduced water supply means only a few small pools remain functional, and those at lukewarm temperatures that make bathing more ordeal than pleasure. The bath attendants, once proud professionals who maintained complex heating and cleaning systems, now function more as guards protecting the facility's valuable bronze fixtures from theft. They've learned to operate the baths with minimal water, recycling and rationing supplies in ways that Roman engineers never intended. The elegant social rituals that once defined Roman bathing culture have been reduced to quick, practical washing sessions that serve hygiene needs without providing cultural enrichment. Historians still argue whether infrastructure decay was a symptom or cause of imperial decline. But from your daily perspective, both seem true simultaneously. Failing aqueducts make urban life more difficult, driving people away from cities and reducing the tax base needed to fund repairs. Meanwhile, political instability and economic crisis prevent the long-term investment and planning necessary to maintain complex engineering systems. You discover that different neighbourhoods are adapting to water shortages in fascinatingly diverse ways. Some communities have organised cooperative well-digging projects, pooling resources to access groundwater that doesn't depend on aqueduct systems. Others have established elaborate rain collection systems using roof gutters and storage cisterns. A few entrepreneurial Romans have begun operating water delivery services, using carts to transport supplies from functioning fountains to paying customers. The Germanic settlers in your district approach water problems with practical solutions that complement rather than replace Roman infrastructure. Athenaric shows you how his family has modified their roof to channel rainwater into storage containers, a technique he learned during military campaigns in regions without reliable aqueducts. Romans build magnificently, he observes, but they sometimes forget that simple methods can work alongside complex ones. Religious responses to the water crisis reveal how Romans are psychologically processing infrastructure failure. Some citizens interpret the aqueduct problems as divine punishment for abandoning traditional gods in favour of Christianity. Others view it as a test of Christian faith that requires community cooperation and mutual aid. A few elderly priests of Neptune have begun conducting water blessing ceremonies at the few functioning fountains, though whether from genuine belief or nostalgic performance remains unclear. The economic implications prove as complex as the engineering challenges. Water scarcity increases the value of properties with private wells or cisterns, creating new forms of inequality based on access to basic necessities. Some enterprising Romans have begun investing in water storage and delivery systems, treating the crisis as a business opportunity rather than simply a civic catastrophe. As autumn arrives and you watch the fountain in your neighbourhood produce increasingly sporadic flows, you realise you're witnessing the end of one of Rome's greatest achievements. The aqueduct system that once seemed as permanent as the hills themselves is gradually reverting to the natural landscape, leaving behind magnificent ruins that future generations will marvel at and wonder how they ever functioned. Your evening routine now includes filling every available container whenever water flows from your local fountain, storing supplies against the frequent interruptions that have become normal rather than exceptional. The sound of running water, once so common in Roman cities that poets used it as a metaphor for abundance and continuity, has become precious enough that you sometimes lie awake simply listening to the trickle from partially functioning pipes, grateful for every drop that still finds its way through the deteriorating network of tunnels, arches, and channels that once made Rome the most water-rich city in human history. You're awakened by the sound of loaded carts rumbling past your window in the pre-dawn darkness. But these aren't the usual merchants heading to market with goods to sell. Through your shutters, you can see wealthy Roman families fleeing the city under cover of night, their wagons piled high with household treasures, documents, and whatever portable wealth they can carry. The sight has become disturbingly familiar over the past months. The gradual exodus of Rome's elite as they abandon their ancestral estates for safer havens in distant provinces or foreign kingdoms. Senator Marcus Crassus Fortunatus, whose villa has dominated the hillside overlooking your neighbourhood for 3 generations, loads his final wagon as you watch from your window. His servants work with the desperate efficiency of people who understand they're racing against time. Precious artwork disappears under protective cloth. Bronze statuary gets carefully padded and secured, and wooden chests that likely contain legal documents and family records are handled with reverent care. This isn't a temporary evacuation, it's a permanent farewell. By morning, you walk past the Fortunatus villa to find its gates standing open and unguarded for the first time in living memory. The building itself remains architecturally magnificent. Marble columns still gleam in the sunlight, elaborate mosaics still decorate the entrance halls, and the gardens still show traces of careful cultivation. But without human inhabitants and maintenance, the villa already feels like a beautiful corpse, impressive but lifeless. Your neighbour Gaius, who occasionally worked as a gardener for wealthy families, explains the practical pressures driving this mass departure. The landowners can't collect rents from their rural properties anymore. He tells you while examining abandoned flower beds that will soon be overgrown with weeds. Germanic tribes control most of the countryside now, and they don't recognize Roman property law. Why stay in the city and pay taxes on land you can't actually use? The economic calculus is brutally simple. Roman aristocrats derived their wealth from agricultural estates scattered throughout Italy and the provinces, but these properties have become increasingly dangerous and unprofitable as central authority has collapsed. Germanic confederates, Frankish raiders, and various other tribal groups now control large swaths of territory that Roman law technically still claims, but Roman armies can no longer protect or administer. You spend the afternoon exploring newly abandoned villas throughout the city, and each one tells a similar story of hasty departure and strategic abandonment. Some families have clearly planned their departures carefully, removing everything of value and leaving only architectural elements too large to transport. Others show signs of panic, scattered belongings, partially packed containers, and valuable items left behind in the rush to escape some immediate threat. The Villa Maxima, which once hosted legendary dinner parties attended by poets, philosophers, and government officials, now stands completely empty except for a few feral cats that have claimed the marble halls as their territory. The elaborate dining rooms where Rome's cultural elite once reclined on silk cushions while debating literature and politics echo only with the sound of your footsteps and the occasional scurrying of mice through abandoned kitchens. What strikes you most isn't the loss of luxury, but the dissolution of community networks that wealthy Romans had maintained for centuries. These weren't just private residences. They were cultural institutions where patronage relationships connected artists with sponsors, where political alliances were negotiated over elaborate meals, and where the intellectual life of the city found expression through salon conversations and literary readings. Athanaric, your Gothic neighbour, provides a different perspective on the villa abandonments as you walk together through the increasingly empty wealthy districts. In my homeland, he observes, when leaders abandon their people, they lose the right to lead. Roman nobles are proving they were never really committed to this place. They were just extracting wealth from it. His comment stings because it contains obvious truth. Many of the fleeing aristocrats have spent recent years liquidating Roman assets to purchase properties in Constantinople, Ravenna, or even Gothic kingdoms where they believe their wealth will be safer. Rather than investing in Rome's recovery, they've been preparing escape routes for themselves while ordinary citizens struggle with food shortages and infrastructure collapse. The abandoned villas quickly attract new inhabitants, though not the ones you might expect. Germanic families with official settlement grants begin claiming some of the larger properties, arguing that Roman law allows them to occupy abandoned buildings. A few remaining Roman officials attempt to maintain property records and collect taxes from absent owners, but their efforts seem increasingly futile as the legal framework supporting private ownership simply dissolves. You witness fascinating negotiations as Germanic settlers attempt to purchase abandoned properties from fleeing Romans, often paying in goods rather than the worthless currency that no one trusts anymore. These transactions represent more than simple real estate deals. They're symbolic transfers of power from traditional Roman elites to new social groups that intend to remain permanently in Italy, rather than treating it as a source of extractable wealth. The cultural implications prove as significant as the economic ones. Villa libraries, accumulated over generations, face uncertain fates as their owners flee. Some aristocrats manage to transport their book collections, but many valuable manuscripts get left behind or sold hastily to anyone willing to pay. You discover scrolls of classical poetry being used as wrapping material in markets, their literary value unrecognized by Germanic merchants who see only useful parchment. Religious institutions step into some of the gaps left by fleeing aristocrats. Christian monasteries begin acquiring abandoned properties, converting elaborate dining halls into chapels and luxurious bedrooms into austere cells for monks. The transformation feels symbolic. Worldly Roman excess giving way to spiritual Christian simplicity. Though the monks seem quite practical about utilizing the excellent plumbing and heating systems that Roman engineers had installed. The psychological impact on remaining Romans proves profound and complex. Some citizens feel abandoned and betrayed by elites who promised to support the community, but fled when challenges became serious. Others express relief at the departure of aristocrats whose political machinations had contributed to Rome's problems. A few enterprising Romans begin claiming abandoned properties for themselves, arguing that residence and use create stronger ownership claims than absent legal titles. Historians still argue whether aristocratic flight was primarily motivated by rational economic calculation or cowardly self-preservation. But from your perspective, the motivations matter less than the consequences. The departure of wealthy families removes not just individual resources, but entire networks of patronage. employment, and cultural activity that had sustained urban life for centuries. The evening brings strange sounds from the wealthy districts, not the familiar noises of dinner parties and musical entertainment, but the hollow echoes of wind whistling through empty halls and the occasional crash of tiles falling from unmaintained roofs. You fall asleep wondering whether Rome can survive as a city when the people who built and funded it have decided to build their futures elsewhere. Winter arrives early, and the abandoned villas stand like monuments to impermanence, their marble columns and elaborate gardens slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. But new patterns of life are already emerging among the ruins, Germanic families adapting Roman architecture to their own needs, Christian communities finding sacred purpose in secular spaces, and ordinary Romans learning that they can create meaningful lives without aristocratic leadership. The city is changing, but it's not dying. It's being reborn in forms that its original builders never imagined. You discover the monastery of San Lorenzo completely by accident while searching for a copy of Virgil's Aeneid that you'd heard might be available for trade near the old Campus Martius. Following directions from a street vendor who spoke in a mixture of Latin and Gothic, you find yourself standing before heavy wooden doors set into what was once a prosperous merchant's warehouse. The transformation is remarkable. Where goods once flowed in and out of commercial storage, black-robed monks now move with purposeful silence, carrying armloads of scrolls and codices like precious cargo. Brother Marcus, a surprisingly young man whose shaved head and simple robes can't entirely conceal his aristocratic bearing, welcomes you into what has become one of Rome's most important repositories of written knowledge. The main hall, originally designed for storing grain and wine, now houses countless wooden shelves lined with manuscripts that represent centuries of human learning. The air carries the distinctive smell of parchment, ink, and the beeswax used to preserve delicate texts. "We're saving what we can," Brother Marcus explains as he guides you through narrow aisles between towering bookcases. Every week, someone brings us scrolls from abandoned villas, closed schools, or bankrupt merchant families. Sometimes they want payment. Sometimes they're just grateful that someone values these works enough to preserve them. His voice carries the urgency of someone engaged in a race against time and entropy. The scale of the preservation effort becomes apparent as you explore deeper into the monastery. Dozens of monks work at copying desks, meticulously reproducing texts by hand onto fresh parchment. Their work requires extraordinary skill, not just literacy, which has become increasingly rare, but knowledge of different scripts, languages, and scholarly conventions. A single mistake could corrupt a text for future generations, so each copyist works with painstaking attention to detail. You watch Brother Augustine, an elderly monk whose fingers are permanently stained with ink, copying what appears to be a mathematical treatise by an Alexandrian scholar. He pauses frequently to consult other texts, verifying calculations and cross-referencing formulas with a precision that would impress any Roman engineer. Mathematics doesn't change, he tells you with a gentle smile, but the people who understand it sometimes disappear. We're ensuring that future scholars can pick up where we leave off. The monastery's collection reveals the breadth of knowledge that Romans accumulated over centuries of conquest and cultural synthesis. Greek philosophy sits beside Egyptian astronomy. Germanic legal codes are stored next to Roman agricultural manuals, and Christian theology shares shelf space with pagan poetry. The monks seem remarkably tolerant of intellectual diversity, preserving works based on their scholarly value rather than their religious orthodoxy. Brother Marcus shows you the scriptorium's most ambitious project, a comprehensive encyclopedia that attempts to summarize all essential knowledge in a single, portable collection. "We don't know what the future will look like," he explains, "but we can give future generations the tools they'll need to rebuild civilization if necessary. This encyclopedia contains everything from basic arithmetic to advanced engineering, from medical treatments to agricultural techniques. The preservation work faces constant practical challenges that would have been unimaginable during Rome's prosperous centuries. Parchment has become expensive and difficult to obtain as traditional supply chains have broken down. High-quality inks require exotic ingredients that Germanic traders don't always carry. Even basic tools like writing styluses and binding needles must be crafted by the monks themselves, since specialized craftsmen have largely disappeared from the city. You discover that the monks have developed ingenious solutions to these resource constraints. They've learned to make ink from local materials, oak galls, iron filings, and wine dregs combined according to ancient recipes that Brother Augustine reconstructed from fragmentary texts. They recycle parchment by carefully scraping old documents clean and reusing the prepared animal skins for new copying projects. They even grow their own herbs for making glues and preservatives used in bookbinding. The human stories behind the preservation effort prove as compelling as the technical challenges. Many of the monks are former Roman aristocrats who chose religious life as traditional career paths disappeared. Brother Cassius was once a rhetoric teacher who fled to the monastery when his school closed due to lack of students and funding. Brother Felix had been training for the imperial civil service before deciding that preserving knowledge served society better than administering a collapsing bureaucracy. These educated refugees bring crucial skills to the preservation project, but they also represent the broader transformation of Roman society. The traditional routes to prestige and prosperity, military service, political office, commercial success have become increasingly unavailable, pushing talented individuals toward religious institutions that offer both meaningful work and basic security. You spend an afternoon helping Brother Marcus catalogue newly acquired manuscripts, and the variety of texts reveals how desperate Romans have become to exchange knowledge for basic necessities. A former senator's library arrives in exchange for winter food supplies. A merchant's collection of geographical treatises trades for warm clothing and lamp oil. Even love letters written by famous poets find their way to the monastery when the owners need immediate resources for survival. The cataloguing process requires detective work that would challenge professional scholars. Many manuscripts arrive without clear attribution or dating, forcing the monks to analyse handwriting styles, parchment quality, and textual references to determine their origins and significance. Brother Thomas, who specialises in this work, can identify the approximate date and region where a text was copied simply by examining the shape of individual letters and the composition of the ink. Historians still argue whether monasteries saved classical civilization or transformed it beyond recognition. But watching the monks work, you see both processes happening simultaneously. They preserve ancient texts faithfully, but they also select which works deserve copying based on their own values and priorities. Christian theology receives more attention than pagan ritual practices. Practical knowledge gets prioritized over abstract philosophy, and moral instruction takes precedence over entertainment literature. The monastery serves functions beyond simple preservation. It's becoming an active centre of intellectual life in a city where traditional schools and libraries have largely disappeared. Visiting scholars arrive regularly to consult specific texts or participate in discussions about theological and philosophical questions. Even Germanic leaders send representatives to research legal precedents and administrative procedures that might help them govern their new territories more effectively. Brother Marcus confides that the monastery maintains secret contacts with similar institutions throughout the former empire, creating an informal network for sharing and preserving knowledge. Monks travel between monasteries carrying copies of important texts, ensuring that crucial works exist in multiple locations. If barbarians burn one monastery, he explains, the knowledge survives in others. We're creating a distributed library that no single catastrophe can destroy. As evening falls and the monks gather for their final prayers of the day, You realize you're witnessing one of history's most crucial transitions. The classical world's knowledge isn't disappearing. It's being transformed and transmitted through institutions that will outlast the political structures that created it. The Roman Empire may be collapsing, but Roman learning will survive in new forms adapted to new circumstances. Walking home through darkening streets, you carry with you a copied portion of Virgil's Aeneid that brother Marcus provided in exchange for a small donation of lamp oil. The familiar verses about Aeneas founding a new civilization after Troy's destruction feel prophetic in ways that ancient audiences could never have imagined. Perhaps every ending contains the seeds of its own renewal, preserved by people wise enough to look beyond immediate crises toward distant possibilities. You find yourself in the extraordinary position of attending court sessions presided over by Odoacer, the Germanic king who now rules Italy in place of the deposed Roman emperor. The venue remains impressively Roman, a marble-columned hall that once hosted imperial audiences, but everything else about the proceedings reflects a fascinating fusion of traditions that would have been unimaginable just a decade ago. Odoacer himself sits on a throne that combines Germanic craftsmanship with Roman imperial symbolism, wearing a purple cloak that signals imperial authority, while his bodyguards carry distinctly non-Roman weapons and shields. What strikes you most immediately is that court business continues to be conducted primarily in Latin, though Odoacer's Latin carries the distinctive accent of someone who learned it as a second language. His vocabulary is remarkably sophisticated, peppered with legal terminology and administrative phrases that demonstrate genuine familiarity with Roman governmental procedures. When a dispute arises between two merchants over a shipping contract, Odoacer refers casually to precedents established under previous emperors and quotes relevant passages from Roman commercial law with the confidence of someone who has studied these materials extensively. The king's advisors represent an intriguing mixture of Germanic nobles and Roman administrators who have chosen to serve the new regime rather than flee to Constantinople or other refuges. Marcus Aurelius Valentinus, a former imperial secretary whose family has served Roman governments for 3 generations, now functions as Odoacer's chief legal counsel. He translates complex Roman legal concepts for Germanic nobles while simultaneously explaining Germanic customary law to Roman citizens who find themselves subject to new authorities. During a property dispute between a Roman landowner and a Gothic settler, you witness how this hybrid legal system actually functions in practice. The Roman presents his case using traditional legal arguments based on written documentation and established precedents, while the Goth relies on oral testimony from community members and appeals to customary practices regarding land use and inheritance. Rather than favouring one system over another, Odoacer carefully weighs both approaches and renders a decision that incorporates elements from each tradition. The administrative efficiency of these proceedings impresses you despite their unconventional nature. While the Roman Senate has essentially ceased to function, Odoacer's court handles practical governance issues with speed and decisiveness that Roman bureaucracy rarely achieved even during its most effective periods. Petitions that might have languished for months in imperial offices receive attention within days. Tax collection, while still challenging due to currency problems, operates more consistently than it has in years. You observe Odoacer addressing a delegation of Roman citizens who have travelled from a distant town to request military protection against bandits. The king listens carefully to their concerns, asks detailed questions about the nature of the threats they face, and promises to dispatch Gothic federates to establish security in their region. His response demonstrates both practical understanding of local conditions and genuine commitment to protecting all inhabitants of his territory, regardless of their ethnic background. The cultural adaptations visible in court ceremonies reveal how Germanic rulers have absorbed Roman concepts of legitimate authority while maintaining their own traditions. Odoacer performs many of the ritual functions that Roman emperors once fulfilled, receiving foreign ambassadors, issuing legal pronouncements, and presiding over religious observances. But he does so within a framework that acknowledges Germanic customs and community structures. Foreign diplomatic missions provide particularly fascinating insights into how other kingdoms view Odoacer's hybrid regime. A Byzantine ambassador presents credentials from Emperor Zeno and conducts negotiations entirely in Greek, which Odoacer handles competently though not with native fluency. A Frankish delegation communicates primarily in their Germanic dialect, with Odoacer serving as translator for his Roman advisors. These linguistic performances demonstrate his remarkable adaptability and political sophistication. The legal cases that come before the court reflect the complex realities of governing a population that includes multiple ethnic groups operating under different customary laws. Marriage disputes between Romans and Goths require careful navigation of conflicting traditions regarding property rights, inheritance, and family obligations. Commercial disagreements involving Germanic traders and Roman merchants must be resolved using principles that both sides can accept as legitimate. Historians still argue whether Odoacer should be considered a barbarian conqueror or legitimate heir to Roman authority. But watching him govern, you see someone who has genuinely internalized Roman administrative methods while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. His decisions consistently demonstrate respect for Roman legal traditions, combined with practical recognition that pure adherence to ancient procedures often proves inadequate for current challenges. The king's personal demeanour surprises you with its combination of Germanic directness and Roman formality. He speaks bluntly about problems and solutions in a way that would have been considered undignified for a Roman emperor. But he also maintains ceremonial protocols that emphasize the continuity of governmental authority. When citizens approach his throne, they perform traditional gestures of respect that date back centuries, and Odoacer responds with the measured dignity that Roman political theory associated with legitimate rulership. Religious matters receive particularly delicate handling in Odoacer's court since his subjects include Catholic Romans, Aryan Germanic peoples, and adherents of various traditional beliefs. Rather than imposing a single religious orthodoxy, the king appears to follow a policy of practical tolerance that allows different communities to maintain their own practices while requiring mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. When theological disputes arise, he typically refers them to religious authorities rather than attempting to resolve doctrinal questions through royal decree. The economic policies emerging from Odoacer's administration show sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing post-imperial Italy. Rather than simply collecting taxes in the Roman manner, his government has adapted to currency problems by accepting payments in goods and services. Land grants to Germanic settlers are managed through careful negotiations that attempt to balance newcomers' needs with existing property rights. Trade regulations acknowledge that commercial networks now extend into Germanic territories that previous Roman administrations could never effectively govern. You witness a particularly revealing moment when a group of former Roman soldiers requests permission to settle in a frontier region where they can establish farms and provide local defense. Odoacer grants their petition enthusiastically, commenting that he values their military experience and agricultural knowledge equally. His response demonstrates how the new regime views citizenship as something earned through contribution rather than inherited through birth, a concept that would have challenged traditional Roman social hierarchies. The court sessions conclude each day with ceremonial elements that blend Germanic and Roman traditions in ways that feel natural rather than forced. Odoacer receives reports from local administrators, issues written orders sealed with an official ring that combines Germanic symbols with Latin inscriptions, and dismisses petitioners with formal phrases that echo imperial protocol while incorporating Germanic concepts of reciprocal obligation between rulers and subjects. As you walk home through streets where Gothic guards patrol alongside Roman citizens conducting normal business, you reflect on how political authority can survive the collapse of specific institutions by adapting to new circumstances while maintaining essential functions. Odoacer may not be a Roman emperor in the traditional sense, but he provides more effective governance than Rome had experienced in decades. Perhaps legitimacy flows less from institutional continuity than from practical competence and genuine commitment to serving all members of the community, regardless of their backgrounds or the legal theories that brought them together. You join a merchant caravan preparing to travel the Via Salaria toward the Adriatic coast, carrying a bundle of woolen cloth that you hope to trade for salt, a commodity that has become precious as traditional supply chains have collapsed. The caravan master, a grizzled veteran named Gaius Mercator, who's been travelling Roman roads for 30 years, briefs his customers on new realities that would have been unthinkable during the height of imperial power. "We travel in groups now," he explains matter-of-factly, "and we go armed. The roads that used to be safer than city streets are now hunting grounds for desperate men." The transformation of Roman transportation networks represents one of the most visible signs of imperial collapse, and you witness it firsthand as your caravan assembles at dawn. Where merchant expeditions once consisted of a few guards protecting valuable cargo, your group resembles a small military unit. 23 armed men escort only 8 merchants, a ratio that speaks volumes about the deteriorating security situation throughout the Italian countryside. The guards carry a mixture of traditional Roman equipment and Germanic weapons, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of men now seeking employment in private security. Marcus, a former legionary who served in Gaul before returning to find his pension worthless and his veterans' benefits discontinued, serves as the caravan's military commander. His weathered face tells stories of campaigns along distant frontiers, but now he applies those same skills to protecting wool merchants from bandits who operate with impunity just 20 miles from Rome. The irony, he tells you as the caravan begins moving, is that I'm fighting the same kind of raids I used to suppress for the Empire, except now I'm doing it for private pay. The Via Salaria itself shows clear signs of neglect that become more pronounced as you travel farther from the city. Sections of the famous Roman pavement have buckled and cracked without repair, forcing the caravan to take detours that add hours to what should be a straightforward journey. Bridges that once carried traffic safely across streams and ravines now require careful inspection before crossing, since several have suffered structural damage that no government agency has resources to address. You pass abandoned way stations that once provided reliable accommodation and fresh horses for travellers, their empty buildings serving as stark reminders of how completely the imperial postal system has collapsed. These facilities, which once enabled rapid communication across vast distances, now stand as monuments to governmental functions that seem permanent but prove surprisingly fragile when central funding disappeared and administrative oversight evaporated. The countryside reveals a patchwork of political control that defies simple categorization. Some areas remain under nominal Roman authority, with local officials collecting taxes and maintaining basic order. Others have been formally granted to Germanic federates who govern according to their own customs while acknowledging Odoacer's overall sovereignty. A few regions appear to be controlled by warlords of uncertain background who rule through force rather than any recognized legal authority. At a river crossing controlled by a self-proclaimed Chimes named Flavius Maximus, your caravan must pay tribute that amounts to highway robbery disguised as taxation. Maximus claims authority from Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, but his soldiers are clearly Germanic mercenaries who serve whoever pays them regularly. The negotiation process reveals how completely traditional Roman administrative structures have broken down. Legitimate authority has become indistinguishable from successful extortion. The human cost of road insecurity becomes apparent when your caravan encounters refugees fleeing bandit attacks on isolated farms and small towns. Families carrying everything they own in handcarts describe raids that combine pure criminality with ethnic revenge, as displaced peoples settle old grievances through violence that no effective government exists to prevent or punish. The distinction between warfare and brigandage has essentially disappeared in regions where law enforcement has ceased to function. Germanic travellers, you discover, often move with greater confidence than Romans along these same dangerous roads. Their tribal networks provide intelligence about safe routes and dangerous areas, while their reputation for military competence deters some attacks that might target more vulnerable groups. Athanaric's cousin, a Gothic merchant named Alaric who joins your caravan at a way station, explains that Germanic peoples maintain informal communication systems that Roman authorities never fully understood or effectively utilized. The trade goods moving along compromised Roman roads tell stories of economic transformation that extend far beyond simple political change. Traditional Roman exports like wine and olive oil travel alongside Germanic amber and furs, Byzantine silks and spices, and exotic items from trading networks that stretch into regions the Roman Empire never controlled. The collapse of Roman commercial hegemony has opened opportunities for other peoples to develop their own economic relationships. You witness fascinating adaptations as merchants learn to navigate this new environment. Some have formed permanent partnerships with Germanic traders who provide both security and access to northern markets. Others have established bases in fortified towns where they can store goods safely while waiting for favourable travel conditions. A few enterprising Romans have learned Germanic languages and customs, essentially reinventing themselves as cultural intermediaries in a multilingual commercial world. The caravan's evening camps reveal how travel culture has evolved to address contemporary dangers, rather than staying in roadside inns that no longer exist or can't guarantee safety. Merchants now sleep in defensive circles with guards posted throughout the night. Campfire conversations blend news gathering with intelligence sharing. As travellers exchange information about road conditions, political developments, and opportunities for profitable trade, bandits attack your caravan on the third day of travel, emerging from wooded hills in a coordinated assault that suggests military training rather than desperate opportunism. The engagement lasts less than an hour, but it demonstrates how completely the security situation has deteriorated. These aren't starving peasants driven to crime by necessity. They're organised groups that have essentially established alternative governmental control over transportation corridors. Marcus and his guards repel the attack efficiently, though not without casualties that soberly remind everyone why private security has become so expensive. The wounded are treated with supplies the caravan carries specifically for this purpose, while captured bandits are interrogated to gather intelligence about other groups operating in the region. The professionalism of these preparations reveals how routine such encounters have become. Historians still argue whether the collapse of Roman road security was primarily due to military weakness or administrative failure. But experiencing it firsthand, you see both factors reinforcing each other in destructive cycles. Unsafe roads reduce tax collection and commercial activity, which limits resources available for security forces, which makes roads even less safe. The Roman transportation network that once enabled rapid movement of goods, people, and information across vast distances has become a liability rather than an asset. Reaching your destination feels like completing a military campaign rather than a simple commercial journey. The Adriatic port town shows signs of adaptation to new realities, stronger fortifications, more diverse populations, and commercial relationships that extend into Germanic territories rather than focusing exclusively on traditional Roman markets. Your salt trading proves successful, but the experience of getting there has changed your perspective on what civilization means when the institutions that once guaranteed safety and predictability have simply vanished. The return journey to Rome will require the same precautions, the same risks, and the same acknowledgement that travel has become an adventure rather than a routine business activity. As you prepare for the trip home, you realize you're living through a fundamental transformation in how people move through physical space and social structures, adapting ancient infrastructure to serve new purposes in a world that Roman engineers never imagined when they built roads designed to last forever. You approach the Colosseum on what everyone whispers will be one of the final days of gladiatorial games, though no official announcement has declared the end of a tradition that has entertained Romans for over 4 centuries. The massive amphitheatre still dominates the landscape with its architectural magnificence, but the atmosphere surrounding it feels fundamentally different from the electric anticipation that once drew crowds from across the empire. Instead of the usual throngs of excited spectators, you see scattered groups of people who seem more motivated by nostalgia than genuine enthusiasm for the violent spectacles about to unfold. The ticket sellers, once shrewd businessmen who could demand premium prices for popular events, now practically beg passers-by to attend. Best seats available, calls out an aging vendor whose family has worked these same stone archways for generations. See the legendary gladiators before they're gone forever. His desperation is palpable, not just for the handful of coins you might spend, but for the validation that someone still cares about the cultural institution his family has served their entire lives. Inside the arena, the contrast between past grandeur and present decline becomes starkly apparent. The sand-covered floor where legendary fighters once battled exotic beasts from Africa and distant provinces now hosts perhaps a dozen gladiators, most of them older men whose best fighting years have passed, or young men who couldn't find better employment in a collapsing economy. The elaborate staging that once featured mechanical elevators, rotating platforms, and complex water displays has been simplified to basic sword fights and wrestling matches that any neighbourhood could organise. Marcus Flavius Maximus, the lanista who manages what remains of the gladiatorial troupe, greets you with the weary dignity of someone watching his life's work slowly dissolve. His familiar gladiatoria once numbered over 100 fighters representing different combat styles from throughout the known world, but economic realities have reduced his stable to fewer than 20 men. The exotic animals cost more than we can possibly earn, he explains, gesturing toward empty cages that once housed lions, tigers, and bears. Even basic equipment has become difficult to afford. The gladiators themselves present a fascinating mixture of traditional fighters maintaining ancient customs and desperate men seeking any form of steady employment. Gaius Britannicus, a veteran retiarius whose net and trident fighting style made him famous during more prosperous times, continues training younger fighters in techniques that may never again be used before appreciative audiences. His dedication to craft transcends immediate practical concerns. He's preserving knowledge that he believes represents something essential about Roman culture. You discover that several Germanic warriors have joined the gladiatorial ranks, though their motivations differ significantly from traditional Roman or slave fighters. They view arena combat as an opportunity to demonstrate martial skills and earn respect within their new communities rather than as punishment or path to freedom. Their fighting styles, adapted from battlefield techniques rather than arena traditions, introduce variations that both excite and disturb spectators accustomed to more formal gladiatorial conventions. The audience that gathers for today's games represents a cross-section of Rome's remaining population, though conspicuously absent are the wealthy aristocrats whose enthusiasm once made gladiatorial contests major social events. Working-class Romans attend from habit and nostalgia. Germanic settlers come from curiosity about Roman customs, and a few Christian citizens appear despite religious reservations about blood sports. The social dynamics that once made the arena a place for displaying wealth and status have largely disappeared. Emperor Romulus Augustulus makes no appearance. Unlike predecessors who used gladiatorial games to demonstrate imperial magnificence and popular support, his absence symbolizes how completely the connection between political power and public entertainment has been severed. The games continue not because they serve governmental purposes, but because private organizers hope to extract whatever profit remains from a dying institution. The fights themselves maintain technical quality despite reduced resources and smaller audiences. Professional gladiators have trained their entire lives for arena combat, and their skills don't diminish simply because fewer people appreciate their expertise. When veteran gladiator Spartacus the Younger faces a Germanic warrior using traditional weapons, their contest demonstrates martial artistry that would have impressed crowds during the Empire's golden age. Religious tensions surrounding the games have intensified as Christianity becomes more dominant in Roman society. Several bishops have spoken against gladiatorial contests as pagan brutality incompatible with Christian values. While traditional Romans view the games as essential expressions of Roman identity that shouldn't be abandoned simply because of changing religious fashions, you overhear heated debates between spectators about whether watching men fight represents legitimate entertainment or sinful behaviour. The economic realities underlying gladiatorial decline extend beyond simple attendance problems. Training gladiators requires substantial investment in equipment, medical care, housing, and food for men whose fighting careers may be brief and whose commercial value depends on maintaining peak physical condition. Without imperial subsidies or wealthy private sponsors, these costs have become prohibitive for most Lanistae who once operated profitable gladiatorial schools. Germanic perspectives on arena combat reveal cultural differences that Romans are still learning to navigate. While they appreciate martial skill and personal courage, many Germanic peoples view fighting for entertainment rather than practical purposes as wasteful and degrading. Their preference for combat that serves community defense or settles genuine disputes conflicts with Roman traditions of spectacle fighting designed purely for audience pleasure. The afternoon's final contest features what everyone understands to be a symbolic moment, the retirement fight of Marcus Aurelius Victor. The last gladiator trained entirely within traditional Roman methods, his opponent, a young Germanic fighter who learned arena techniques from veterans, represents the future of combat entertainment in post-imperial Italy. Their bout becomes a metaphor for cultural transition that extends far beyond the sand-covered arena floor. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial games declined primarily due to Christian opposition or economic constraints, but watching these final contests, you see both factors working together to end traditions that once seemed permanently embedded in Roman culture. The Christianity that discourages blood sports provides moral justification for abandoning expensive entertainments that collapsing imperial finances can no longer support. As the games conclude and spectators file out of the gradually emptying Colosseum, you realize you've witnessed the end of an era that defined Roman identity for centuries. The arena that once hosted spectacles viewed by hundreds of thousands of people will soon fall silent, its purpose exhausted, along with the imperial system that created and sustained it. Future generations will marvel at the engineering that made such entertainments possible while struggling to understand why anyone thought them necessary. Walking home through streets where Germanic families now live alongside Romans, you reflect on how cultural institutions adapt or disappear as societies transform. The martial skills displayed in the arena won't vanish. They'll find new applications in the very different world that's emerging from the ruins of the Western Empire. But the specific combination of wealth, power, engineering, and cultural values that created gladiatorial games has disappeared forever, leaving behind only magnificent ruins and fading memories of when Rome could afford to stage elaborate fights purely for the pleasure of watching skilled men risk their lives for public entertainment. The setting sun casts long shadows through the Colosseum's arches, and for a moment, you can almost hear the echoes of crowds that will never again fill those stone seats with their roars of approval and disappointment. You approach the Colosseum on what everyone whispers will be one of the final days of gladiatorial games, though no official announcement has declared the end of a tradition that has entertained Romans for over 4 centuries. The massive amphitheatre still dominates the landscape with its architectural magnificence, but the atmosphere surrounding it feels fundamentally different from the electric anticipation that once drew crowds from across the empire. Instead of the usual throngs of excited spectators, you see scattered groups of people who seem more motivated by nostalgia than genuine enthusiasm for the violent spectacles about to unfold. The ticket sellers, once shrewd businessmen who could demand premium prices for popular events, now practically beg passers-by to attend. Best seats available, calls out an aging vendor whose family has worked these same stone archways for generations. See the legendary gladiators before they're gone forever. His desperation is palpable, not just for the handful of coins you might spend, but for the validation that someone still cares about the cultural institution his family has served their entire lives. Inside the arena, the contrast between past grandeur and present decline becomes starkly apparent. The sand-covered floor where legendary fighters once battled exotic beasts from Africa and distant provinces now hosts perhaps a dozen gladiators, most of them older men whose best fighting years have passed, or young men who couldn't find better employment in a collapsing economy. The elaborate staging that once featured mechanical elevators, rotating platforms, and complex water displays has been simplified to basic sword fights and wrestling matches that any neighbourhood could organise. Marcus Flavius Maximus, the lanista who manages what remains of the gladiatorial troupe, greets you with the weary dignity of someone watching his life's work slowly dissolve. His familia gladiatoria once numbered over 100 fighters representing different combat styles from throughout the known world, but economic realities have reduced his stable to fewer than 20 men. The exotic animals cost more than we can possibly earn, he explains, gesturing toward empty cages that once housed lions, tigers, and bears. Even basic equipment has become difficult to afford. The gladiators themselves present a fascinating mixture of traditional fighters maintaining ancient customs and desperate men seeking any form of steady employment. Gaius Britannicus, a veteran retiarius whose net and trident fighting style made him famous during more prosperous times, continues training younger fighters in techniques that may never again be used before appreciative audiences. His dedication to craft transcends immediate practical concerns. He's preserving knowledge that he believes represents something essential about Roman culture. You discover that several Germanic warriors have joined the gladiatorial ranks. Though their motivations differ significantly from traditional Roman or slave fighters, they view arena combat as an opportunity to demonstrate martial skills and earn respect within their new communities, rather than as punishment or path to freedom. Their fighting styles, adapted from battlefield techniques rather than arena traditions, introduce variations that both excite and disturb spectators accustomed to more formal gladiatorial conventions. The audience that gathers for today's games represents a cross-section of Rome's remaining population. Though conspicuously absent are the wealthy aristocrats whose enthusiasm once made gladiatorial contests major social events. Working-class Romans attend from habit and nostalgia. Germanic settlers come from curiosity about Roman customs, and a few Christian citizens appear despite religious reservations about blood sports. The social dynamics that once made the arena a place for displaying wealth and status have largely disappeared. Emperor Romulus Augustulus makes no appearance. Unlike predecessors who used gladiatorial games to demonstrate imperial magnificence and popular support, His absence symbolizes how completely the connection between political power and public entertainment has been severed. The games continue not because they serve governmental purposes, but because private organisers hope to extract whatever profit remains from a dying institution. The fights themselves maintain technical quality despite reduced resources and smaller audiences. Professional gladiators have trained their entire lives for arena combat, and their skills don't diminish simply because fewer people appreciate their expertise. When veteran gladiator Spartacus the Younger faces a Germanic warrior using traditional weapons, their contest demonstrates martial artistry that would have impressed crowds during the Empire's Golden Age. Religious tensions surrounding the games have intensified as Christianity becomes more dominant in Roman society. Several bishops have spoken against gladiatorial contests as pagan brutality incompatible with Christian values, while traditional Romans view the games as essential expressions of Roman identity that shouldn't be abandoned simply because of changing religious fashions. You overhear heated debates between spectators about whether watching men fight represents legitimate entertainment or sinful behaviour. The economic realities underlying gladiatorial decline extend beyond simple attendance problems. Training gladiators requires substantial investment in equipment, medical care, housing, and food for men whose fighting careers may be brief and whose commercial value depends on maintaining peak physical condition. Without imperial subsidies or wealthy private sponsors, these costs have become prohibitive for most Lanistae who once operated profitable gladiatorial schools. Germanic perspectives on arena combat reveal cultural differences that Romans are still learning to navigate. While they appreciate martial skill and personal courage, many Germanic peoples view fighting for entertainment rather than practical purposes as wasteful and degrading. Their preference for combat that serves community defence or settles genuine disputes conflicts with Roman traditions of spectacle fighting designed purely for audience pleasure. The afternoon's final contest features what everyone understands to be a symbolic moment: the retirement fight of Marcus Aurelius Victor, the last gladiator trained entirely within traditional Roman methods. His opponent, a young Germanic fighter who learned arena techniques from veterans, represents the future of combat entertainment in post-imperial Italy. Their bout becomes a metaphor for cultural transition that extends far beyond the sand-covered arena floor. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial games declined primarily due to Christian opposition or economic constraints, but watching these final contests, you see both factors working together to end traditions that once seemed permanently embedded in Roman culture. The Christianity that discourages blood sports provides moral justification for abandoning expensive entertainments that collapsing imperial finances can no longer support. As the games conclude and spectators file out of the gradually emptying Colosseum, you realise you've witnessed the end of an era that defined Roman identity for centuries. The arena that once hosted spectacles viewed by hundreds of thousands of people will soon fall silent, its purpose exhausted, along with the imperial system that created and sustained it. Future generations will marvel at the engineering that made such entertainments possible while struggling to understand why anyone thought them necessary. Walking home through streets where Germanic families now live alongside Romans, you reflect on how cultural institutions adapt or disappear as societies transform. The martial skills displayed in the arena won't vanish. They'll find new applications in the very different world that's emerging from the ruins of the Western Empire. But the specific combination of wealth, power, engineering, and cultural values that created gladiatorial games has disappeared forever, leaving behind only magnificent ruins and fading memories of when Rome could afford to stage elaborate fights purely for the pleasure of watching skilled men risk their lives for public entertainment. The setting sun casts long shadows through the Colosseum's arches, and for a moment you can almost hear the echoes of crowds that will never again fill those stone seats with their roars of approval and disappointment. You stand among a growing crowd gathered in the Campus Martius, watching what might be the last formal parade of Roman legionaries ever to march through the streets of the Eternal City, the Quintusisque Legion Deotariana. Reduced to fewer than 300 men from its original complement of over 5,000, moves with the disciplined precision that has characterized Roman military formations for centuries. But their faces tell a different story. These are soldiers without an empire to serve, warriors whose oaths of loyalty bind them to institutions that no longer exist in any meaningful sense. Marcus Aurelius Severus, the legion's tribune, rides at the head of the column wearing dress armour that has been carefully maintained despite years of uncertain supply lines and irregular pay. His purple cloak and polished bronze cuirass represent traditions stretching back to the legendary founders of Roman military power, but the men following him carry equipment that tells a more complex story. Some bear the standardized gear that once identified Roman soldiers throughout the known world, while others have adopted Germanic weapons and armour that prove more practical under current circumstances. The Legion's eagle standard still gleams in the afternoon sunlight, its golden wings and thunderbolt symbols evoking the divine authority that Roman armies once carried to the edges of the civilized world. But the standard bearer, a grizzled veteran named Gaius Flavius, who has served for over 20 years, confides to you that this will be his final duty as keeper of the sacred emblem. "The eagle deserves better than this," he says quietly, gesturing toward the sparse crowd of spectators who represent all that remains of Roman civic enthusiasm for military ceremony. These soldiers march not toward new campaigns, but toward discharge and uncertain futures in a world that no longer requires their specialized skills. Veterans who once could expect comfortable retirement on granted lands or steady employment in imperial bureaucracy now face the same economic insecurity as ordinary citizens. Their military training, while valuable, must be adapted to civilian occupations that may bear little resemblance to the structured military life they've known since adolescence. Tribune Severus addresses his troops in the Forum Romanum, delivering what amounts to a farewell speech that acknowledges realities no Roman military commander should ever have to face. "You have served Rome faithfully," he tells the assembled legionaries, "but Rome must now find new forms while you find new purposes. The empire you swore to defend has ended, but the principles you embodied, discipline, loyalty, courage, and sacrifice, will endure in whatever lives you choose to build." The emotional response among the troops reveals how completely their world has transformed. Some veterans weep openly at the dissolution of bonds that have defined their identities for decades. Others express relief at being released from obligations to an empire that could no longer provide basic support for military operations. A few Germanic soldiers who had joined Roman forces seem almost eager to return to their tribal communities where their skills will be appreciated and their loyalty properly rewarded. You follow several veterans as they strip off their military equipment for the final time, a ritual that feels both liberating and devastating. Gaius Cornelius, a centurion who commanded the same century for 15 years, carefully folds his red cloak and removes the vine stick that symbolized his authority over subordinates. "I've carried this stick through Gaul, Germania, and 3 civil wars," he tells you, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it's just a piece of wood with no meaning beyond memory." The practical implications of military demobilization extend far beyond ceremonial endings. These soldiers possess combat skills, engineering knowledge, administrative experience, and organizational capabilities that represent substantial human capital. But transitioning to civilian occupations requires resources and opportunities that contemporary Rome can barely provide. Some veterans will find employment as private guards for wealthy families or merchant caravans, while others may join Germanic military units that can offer steady pay and clear purpose. Athanaric, your Gothic neighbour, explains how some Roman veterans are integrating into Germanic military structures that operate according to different principles but value the same fundamental martial virtues. Good soldiers are good soldiers, he observes pragmatically. Their training doesn't become worthless just because the empire that trained them has disappeared. We can use men who understand discipline and tactics, regardless of what god they pray to or what language they learned first. The Legion's engineering corps faces particularly poignant choices as they surrender tools and equipment that enabled some of Rome's greatest infrastructure achievements. These specialists built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications that will outlast the political system that created them. But their expertise may no longer find appropriate applications in a world that can't afford large-scale construction projects. Some will adapt their skills to smaller civilian projects, while others may seek employment with Gothic kings who appreciate Roman engineering capabilities. Religious ceremonies accompanying the military dissolution blend Christian prayers with traditional Roman rituals in ways that would have seemed impossible during the height of imperial power. Chaplains bless soldiers regardless of their specific religious affiliations, while veterans participate in ancient ceremonies honouring military standards, even if they no longer believe in the gods those standards represent. The spiritual significance of military service transcends particular theological frameworks. The Legion's medical personnel, trained in battlefield surgery and military hygiene, represent particularly valuable human resources for communities struggling with inadequate healthcare. Several Germanic leaders actively recruit Roman military doctors who understand both traditional medicine and practical field treatments. These physicians can adapt their knowledge to civilian needs while training new practitioners in techniques that might otherwise be lost, along with institutional military medicine. Veterans' families face their own challenges as military communities dissolve and support networks disappear. Women who married soldiers expecting lifetime security now must navigate economic uncertainty with husbands whose primary skills relate to warfare rather than civilian occupations. Children who grew up in military camps must adapt to civilian life without the structure and predictability that characterize their early years. Some former legionaries band together to form security companies that provide services to merchant guilds, wealthy landowners, and Germanic administrators who need disciplined forces but don't want to maintain permanent military establishments. These private military contractors preserve Roman tactical knowledge while adapting to contemporary security challenges that differ significantly from traditional imperial warfare. Historians still argue whether Roman military decline was primarily due to external pressure from barbarian armies or internal problems with recruitment and funding. But watching these final legions disband, you see both factors operating simultaneously. External threats required military responses that Rome could no longer afford, while internal problems made effective military action increasingly impossible, creating downward spirals that ultimately proved insurmountable. The evening finds many veterans gathering in taverns throughout the city, sharing stories and maintaining friendships that will outlast the institutional structures that originally brought them together. These informal networks may prove more durable than formal military organizations, preserving camaraderie and mutual support among men who shared extraordinary experiences under impossible circumstances. As you walk home through streets that will no longer echo with the sound of marching legions, you realize you've witnessed the end of a military tradition that shaped the ancient world for over a millennium. The disciplined formations that once conquered vast territories and imposed Roman law across diverse populations have finally acknowledged that their time has passed. But the human qualities that made them effective, loyalty, courage, adaptability, and brotherhood, will continue in new forms adapted to whatever challenges the future may bring. The last Roman eagles have been furled, but the men who carried them march forward into uncertain tomorrows with the same steady determination that once made them masters of the known world. You receive the startling news through a Gothic merchant who arrives at your neighbourhood market speaking excitedly in a mixture of Latin and his native tongue about proclamations being issued from distant provincial capitals. At first, the information seems impossible to believe. Governors and military commanders throughout what was once the unified Western Empire are declaring themselves independent kings, rejecting any remaining authority from Rome, Ravenna, or Constantinople. But as more travellers arrive with similar reports, you realise you're witnessing the final fragmentation of imperial unity into a patchwork of successor kingdoms that may never again acknowledge common sovereignty. The proclamation from Syagrius in northern Gaul arrives as an official document written on expensive parchment and sealed with an elaborate wax impression that attempts to convey royal rather than provincial authority. His declaration, read aloud in the forum by a Germanic interpreter since few Romans can still read formal Latin, announces the establishment of the Kingdom of Soissons and formally renounces any obligations to imperial taxation, military service, or administrative oversight. What strikes you most forcefully is how confidently Syagrius assumes powers that Roman law never granted to provincial governors. Marcus Aurelius Corvus, one of the few remaining senators who maintains connections with distant regions, explains the practical forces driving these independence declarations. Provincial commanders have been governing without imperial support for years. He tells you over wine that has become increasingly expensive as trade routes fragment. They collect their own taxes, recruit their own armies, and negotiate their own treaties with local tribes. Declaring independence simply acknowledges realities that already exist rather than creating new political arrangements. The geographic scope of these declarations amazes you as reports arrive from territories spanning the former empire's vast extent. In Britannia, local kings have expelled the last Roman officials and established kingdoms based on tribal territories that existed before the conquest 4 centuries ago. Spanish generals have carved out personal domains while maintaining nominal Roman titles that provide legitimacy for their essentially independent rule. Even in Italy itself, regions beyond Odoacer's direct control operate according to local authority structures that ignore central government entirely. You witness fascinating negotiations as former imperial officials attempt to establish diplomatic relationships with their newly independent neighbours. The process requires completely reimagining political geography that had remained stable for centuries, as borders that once represented administrative convenience become international boundaries defended by armies loyal to competing rulers. Treaties that once governed relationships between provinces now must address interactions between sovereign kingdoms. The economic implications of political fragmentation become apparent when merchants explain how trade relationships are being reorganized around new political realities. Goods that once moved freely throughout the empire now face customs duties, security escorts, and currency exchanges at borders that didn't exist just months ago. A merchant travelling from Gaul to Italy must now negotiate passage through multiple kingdoms, each with its own laws, currencies, and political priorities. Germanic perspectives on these developments reveal how thoroughly the concept of universal empire has been abandoned in favour of more localised political structures. Athanaric receives letters from relatives who describe similar independence movements in Germanic territories, where tribal leaders are establishing kingdoms that combine traditional customs with Roman administrative techniques. Large empires are difficult to maintain, he observes with characteristic practicality. Smaller kingdoms can respond more quickly to local problems and opportunities. Religious authority faces particularly complex challenges as political fragmentation creates competing jurisdictions over the same Christian communities. Bishops who once reported to unified ecclesiastical hierarchies now must navigate relationships with multiple secular rulers who may have conflicting religious policies. The Pope in Rome finds his authority challenged by kings who claim the right to appoint bishops and regulate religious practices within their territories. The independence declarations reveal how completely imperial identity has dissolved among people who once considered themselves inheritors of Roman citizenship. Provincial populations seem largely indifferent to whether they're governed by Roman appointees or local kings, provided their rulers can maintain basic security and administrative services. Political loyalty has become pragmatic rather than ideological, flowing towards whoever can provide effective governance rather than whoever claims legitimate authority. You discover that some independence movements are being supported or even encouraged by Odoacer's administration, which finds it easier to govern Italy directly rather than attempting to maintain control over distant territories that require military resources and administrative attention that are no longer available. Strategic abandonment of peripheral regions allows concentration of limited resources on core territories that can actually be governed effectively. The speed with which imperial unity disintegrates surprises even experienced observers who understood that central authority had been weakening for decades. Within months, political structures that had endured for centuries simply evaporate as local leaders assume powers that nobody exists to challenge. The absence of effective resistance to independence movements demonstrates how thoroughly imperial institutions had already ceased to function in practical terms. Military implications prove as significant as political ones, since former imperial armies now serve different masters with potentially conflicting interests. Veterans who once fought side by side in Roman legions may find themselves facing each other across battle lines as their new kingdoms develop competing territorial claims or economic disputes. The common military culture that once unified diverse peoples now becomes a source of tactical knowledge that opposing armies use against each other. Historians still argue whether imperial fragmentation was primarily caused by administrative breakdown or external pressure from barbarian kingdoms. But experiencing it directly, you see how both factors reinforced each other in ways that made political unity increasingly impossible to maintain. Administrative problems created opportunities for independence movements, while external pressures made central coordination too difficult and expensive to sustain. The psychological impact on remaining Romans proves profound and complex. Some citizens express relief that local rulers may provide more responsive governance than distant imperial bureaucrats ever offered, while others mourn the loss of membership in a universal civilization that once connected them to peoples and cultures throughout the known world. The Roman identity that once transcended local loyalties has fragmented, along with political structures that sustained it. Communication networks that once enabled rapid information exchange across vast distances begin breaking down as political borders interrupt postal routes and diplomatic immunity for imperial messengers ceases to exist. News that once travelled quickly through official channels now depends on merchant caravans and private travellers who may take weeks or months to carry information between regions that were once connected by daily communications. As winter settles over a Rome that can no longer claim authority beyond central Italy, you reflect on how quickly institutions that seem permanent can simply cease to exist when the conditions that sustained them change beyond recognition. The universal empire that once brought peace and law to diverse peoples has dissolved into competing kingdoms that may prove more sustainable precisely because they operate at scales that medieval technology and administrative capabilities can actually support. The imperial purple that once symbolized authority over continents now covers territories measured in days rather than months of travel. But perhaps human communities function better when their rulers can actually visit the people they govern and address problems through direct knowledge rather than bureaucratic reports from distant provinces. The end of empire may not represent civilizational collapse, but rather evolution toward political forms better adapted to contemporary realities and human-scale governance. You venture into the market district this morning to discover conversations happening in languages that would have been unthinkable in Roman public spaces just a generation ago. A Gothic mother bargains with a Roman baker in broken Latin, while her children chatter fluently in 3 tongues, switching between their ancestral Germanic dialect, the Latin they're learning in school, and a curious hybrid that combines words from both traditions with entirely new grammatical structures. The linguistic landscape of Rome is transforming as rapidly as its political and social structures, creating a multilingual urban environment that represents the future of post-imperial Europe. The transformation becomes most apparent when you listen carefully to conversations around the old forum area, where diverse groups now conduct business in whatever combination of languages proves most effective for specific transactions. Germanic traders speak their tribal dialects when discussing strategy among themselves, switch to Latin for formal negotiations with Roman merchants, and sprinkle in Greek phrases when dealing with Byzantine representatives who still maintain commercial connections with the Eastern Empire. The result is a constantly shifting linguistic performance that would challenge even educated interpreters. Children adapt to this multilingual environment with remarkable ease, developing linguistic skills that their parents struggle to match. You observe young Romans teaching Gothic words to their Germanic neighbours' children while simultaneously learning Frankish counting systems and Vandal trade terminology. These linguistic exchanges happen naturally through play, work, and daily interaction, creating a generation that will be genuinely multilingual in ways that previous Roman educational systems never encouraged or enabled. Athanaric's daughter, now 12 years old and perfectly bilingual, serves as an informal translator for community meetings, where important decisions must be made by consensus among residents who don't share common languages. Her ability to convey not just words but cultural concepts between different groups makes her remarkably influential despite her youth. She understands things that adults miss, Athanaric tells you proudly, because she thinks in multiple languages rather than just translating between them. The practical implications of linguistic diversity affect every aspect of daily life, in ways both subtle and profound. Simple transactions that once required basic Latin vocabulary now demand cultural sensitivity and creative communication strategies. When a Frankish smith attempts to explain metallurgical techniques to a Roman customer, they must find ways to convey concepts for which precise Latin equivalents may not exist, leading to improvised vocabularies that blend technical knowledge from different traditions. Religious services present particularly interesting linguistic challenges as Christian communities attempt to maintain unity while accommodating worshippers who prefer different languages for prayer and theological discussion. Some churches conduct services in Latin to preserve traditional forms, while others experiment with Germanic translations of biblical texts that capture spiritual meanings in ways that may actually be more accessible to contemporary congregations than classical Latin formulations. You attend a neighbourhood council meeting where decisions about water distribution and security patrols must be made collectively, and the linguistic negotiations prove as complex as the practical issues being discussed. Points that seem clear when expressed in Latin require extensive clarification when translated into Gothic, not because of linguistic inadequacy, but because different cultures approach collective decision-making through different conceptual frameworks that don't translate directly. The emergence of hybrid languages fascinates linguists and scholars who recognize that they're witnessing the birth of entirely new forms of human communication. Children and young adults unconsciously create grammatical structures that combine Latin syntax with Germanic vocabulary, or apply Gothic logical patterns to Latin root words, producing speech that is comprehensible to speakers of both parent languages while remaining distinctly different from either original tradition. Written communication faces even greater challenges than spoken language. Since literacy rates vary dramatically among different ethnic groups and many Germanic peoples maintain strong oral traditions that don't translate easily to written forms, important documents must often be prepared in multiple languages and scripts. While contracts and legal agreements require careful attention, to ensure that all parties understand obligations and rights that may be expressed differently in various linguistic traditions. Marketplace negotiations reveal how language differences can actually facilitate certain types of economic relationships. When Romans and Goths can't communicate perfectly, they must rely more heavily on demonstrations, physical samples, and standardized measurements that reduce opportunities for misunderstanding. Some merchants discover that limited linguistic overlap forces more honest and direct business practices than elaborate rhetorical traditions ever encouraged. Historians still argue whether linguistic diversity strengthened or weakened late imperial communities, but living through it daily, you see both effects operating simultaneously. Communication challenges slow decision-making and create opportunities for misunderstanding. But linguistic diversity also brings together knowledge traditions and problem-solving approaches that homogeneous communities might never develop. The neighborhood's collective wisdom now includes agricultural techniques from Germanic peoples, commercial practices from various tribal traditions, and administrative methods from Roman experience. Marriage relationships between Romans and Germanics create fascinating linguistic laboratories where couples must negotiate not just personal compatibility, but cultural and linguistic differences that affect everything from child rearing to household management. These cross-cultural families often develop private languages that blend elements from both traditions, while creating entirely new ways of expressing concepts that don't exist in either parent culture. The legal implications of linguistic diversity prove particularly complex when disputes arise between parties who don't share common languages or cultural frameworks for understanding contracts, property rights, and personal obligations. Germanic customary law operates according to principles that don't always translate into Roman legal concepts. While Roman statutory traditions may seem arbitrary or incomprehensible to peoples who prefer oral agreements and community consensus, educational challenges multiply as parents try to prepare children for futures that will require skills their own generation never needed. Young Romans must learn Germanic languages if they want to participate in evolving economic networks. While Germanic children need Latin literacy to access written knowledge traditions and formal administrative positions, these educational demands stretch family resources while creating opportunities for cultural exchange. Germanic storytelling traditions begin influencing Roman literary forms as audiences demand narratives that combine classical themes with heroic traditions from Northern European cultures. Poets experiment with alliterative verse forms that sound strange to ears trained on Latin hexameters, while traditional Roman historical writing incorporates Germanic concepts of fate and heroic destiny that transform how past events are interpreted and future possibilities imagined. As evening settles over your linguistically diverse neighborhood, you listen to the complex symphony of human voices speaking multiple languages simultaneously, children calling to each other in linguistic mixtures their grandparents couldn't understand, adults conducting business in whatever words prove most effective, and elderly residents maintaining traditional languages that may not survive another generation. The sounds represent both loss and creation, as old forms of communication disappear while new possibilities emerge. Walking home through streets where Germanic and Latin words blend in the twilight air, you realize you're witnessing a fundamental transformation in how human communities create and share meaning. The linguistic unity that once characterized Roman civilization has given way to diversity that reflects new social realities. But this diversity also represents possibilities for cultural richness and intellectual complexity that homogeneous societies rarely achieve. Language changes because life changes. And perhaps the multilingual future emerging from imperial collapse will prove more adaptable and resilient than the monumental unity it replaces. You stand on the Palatine Hill as the last rays of sunlight illuminate the imperial palaces one final time before darkness descends over a city that will never again call itself the center of the world. The golden light catches the marble columns and bronze statuary that still proclaim Roman grandeur to the heavens, but the silence surrounding these monuments feels absolute and eternal. No guards patrol the terraces where emperors once walked. No courtiers hurry through corridors where the fate of nations was decided. And no scribes record the daily business of governing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The transformation you've witnessed over these months feels complete as you survey a landscape that remains architecturally magnificent but has become politically irrelevant. The Forum Romanum still displays its marble testimonies to conquered peoples and successful campaigns, but the legal and administrative systems that gave these conquests meaning have evaporated like morning mist. Rome endures as a city, but the Roman Empire has passed into history as definitively as the Babylonian and Persian empires that once seemed equally permanent and inevitable. Below you, the neighbourhoods where you've learned to live in this new world show signs of adaptation rather than collapse. Germanic families have established permanent homes in buildings that once housed Roman aristocrats, their children playing in courtyards where senators' sons once received classical educations. Christian churches occupy temples that were dedicated to gods whose names are already becoming ancient curiosities. Markets operate efficiently despite currency problems. Communities resolve disputes without imperial courts, and daily life continues with rhythms that would be recognizable to any urban population throughout history. Athanaric joins you on the hillside, bringing bread and wine to share as you watch the sunset together. His presence has become comfortable and familiar over these months of learning to live as neighbours rather than conqueror and conquered. My grandfather fought against Rome, he tells you quietly. My father served Rome, and I've watched Rome end, but this place will continue. His words carry neither triumph nor regret, just a practical acceptance of someone who understands that political systems rise and fall while human communities adapt and endure. The evening air carries sounds that tell the story of a city in transition. Children's voices speaking multiple languages, merchants conducting business according to new but workable customs, and artisans practicing trades that blend Roman techniques with Germanic innovations. These sounds represent continuity rather than catastrophe, evolution rather than destruction. The skills and knowledge that made Roman civilization remarkable haven't disappeared. They've been absorbed into new cultural forms that may prove more resilient than the imperial structures that originally produced them. Religious bells ring across the city, calling Christians to evening prayers in churches that increasingly serve diverse congregations where Romans and Germanics worship together. The theological unity of Christianity provides community bonds that transcend the ethnic divisions that once seemed so important, while practical cooperation in daily life creates relationships that matter more than abstract political theories. Perhaps spiritual communities will prove more durable than political empires because they're based on shared values rather than imposed authority. The stars emerge one by one above a Rome that no longer rules the world but has learned to govern itself through cooperation rather than conquest. The administrative genius that once managed provinces spanning 3 continents now focuses on neighbourhood councils, water distribution, and market regulations, humbler tasks, perhaps, but ones that directly improve the lives of actual people rather than serving abstract imperial ambitions. Historians of future centuries will debate whether the fall of Rome represented civilizational collapse or transformation, but experiencing it firsthand, you've seen mostly adaptation and renewal. The political structures that seemed eternal have indeed disappeared, but the human capacities that built those structures, creativity, cooperation, practical intelligence, and moral commitment, remain as strong as ever. New institutions are emerging that may prove better suited to contemporary realities than imperial bureaucracies designed for different times and circumstances. The Germanic kingdoms that are consolidating throughout former imperial territories represent not barbaric chaos, but alternative approaches to governance that combine Roman administrative knowledge with tribal traditions of consultation and consensus. These hybrid political systems may actually serve their populations more effectively than imperial institutions that had become disconnected from local needs and responsive primarily to distant political pressures. Economic networks are reorganizing around new patterns that emphasize regional self-sufficiency rather than long-distance trade dependent on imperial security guarantees. Communities are learning to produce more of what they need locally while developing specialized products for exchange with neighbors. This economic reorientation may create more stable and sustainable prosperity than the extractive imperial economy that concentrated wealth in distant capitals while leaving provinces dependent on political decisions they couldn't influence. Cultural creativity continues and perhaps even flourishes as artists and writers experiment with forms that blend classical traditions with Germanic innovations. The literary works, architectural projects, and artistic productions emerging from this cultural fusion may prove more vital and enduring than late imperial art that had become increasingly rigid and formulaic. Periods of political transition often produce remarkable cultural achievements, as new possibilities emerge from the synthesis of different traditions. Educational institutions are adapting to serve communities that need practical skills more than classical rhetoric, technical knowledge more than abstract philosophy, and multilingual capabilities more than purely Latin literacy. The monasteries, craft guilds, and informal teaching networks that are replacing imperial schools may actually provide more useful education for the world that's emerging from imperial collapse. As complete darkness settles over the eternal city, you reflect on how endings and beginnings intertwine in ways that make historical transitions more complex than simple narratives of decline and fall. The Western Roman Empire has indeed ended, but the people who lived under that empire continue their lives with remarkable adaptability and resilience. They're creating new forms of community, governance, culture, an economic organization that incorporate the best elements of Roman civilization while addressing contemporary challenges that imperial institutions couldn't solve. The medieval world that's being born from these ashes will face its own problems and develop its own solutions, but it will build on foundations that include Roman law, Germanic customs, Christian values, and practical knowledge accumulated over centuries of human experience. Perhaps civilization advances not through preserving unchanged traditions, but through creative adaptation that preserves essential human values while developing new institutions suited to changing circumstances. Walking home through streets that feel both ancient and newly born, you carry with you the profound understanding that you've witnessed not the end of history, but one of its great transformations. The Rome you knew is gone forever, but the possibilities emerging from its transformation may prove more wonderful than anything that came before. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities that require the same human qualities that built the empire: intelligence, cooperation, creativity, and hope, but applied to circumstances that previous generations could never have imagined. The last light fades from the imperial palaces, but the first stars of a medieval dawn already shine in the darkening sky, above a world being reborn. The soft sounds of your diverse neighborhood settling into sleep drift through your window. Germanic lullabies mixing with Latin prayers, children dreaming in multiple languages, and families from different worlds learning to build a shared future together. The great transformation is complete, but life continues with the eternal rhythms that connect all human generations across the centuries. You close your eyes and listen to the breathing of the civilization being born. The sounds of the reborn city fade gradually into gentle whispers as night deepens around you. Your breathing slows to match the peaceful rhythm of a community that has learned to find harmony in diversity, strength in adaptation, and hope in transformation. The marble columns and ancient stones will endure for millennia, silent witnesses to the endless human capacity for renewal and growth. Rest now in the knowledge that every ending carries within it the seeds of new beginnings. The Roman Empire that seemed eternal has indeed passed away, but the human stories that filled its centuries continue in new forms, new languages, and new dreams. Children will grow up in this transformed world, speaking words their grandparents never knew, solving problems with tools both ancient and newly invented, creating art that blends traditions in ways that honour the past while embracing the future. Let your mind drift peacefully through the quiet streets where former enemies have become neighbours, where different peoples have discovered shared hopes, where the end of one great story has become the beginning of countless others. The stars that shine above this sleeping city have witnessed the rise and fall of many civilizations, and they will illuminate many more transformations in the centuries to come. Sleep softly now, knowing that adaptation and renewal flow through human history like rivers finding new channels toward the sea. The empire has fallen, but the people endure, and their children will build wonders that we can only dream. The darkness brings not ending, but rest, and tomorrow will dawn on possibilities as limitless as the human imagination itself. The last echoes of ancient Rome fade into the gentle silence of dreams, where new worlds are always being born.